Hi, my name is Elias Muhanna. I write the Qifa Nabki blog on Lebanese political affairs, and I'm a PhD candidate in Arabic and Islamic Studies at Harvard University.
Hi, Elias. I'm Michael Young. I'm the opinion editor at the Daily Star newspaper in Beirut, and I'm the author of The Ghosts of Martyrs Square, an eyewitness account of Lebanon's life struggle, which came out last year in 2010.
Hi, Michael. How are you doing?
I'm fine, Elias, and you?
I'm very well. It's great to speak again. We're going to be speaking today about the situation in Syria, and more specifically about the U.S. and international community's response to the uprising there, which has gotten bloodier in the past couple of weeks. It's really taken a turn for the more energetic and the more violent. And so we'll be talking a little bit about the UN's response earlier this week, what the United States is doing, what the Obama administration's options are for dealing with the crisis, and then also, sort of in the second half, we might discuss where Lebanon fits into all of this, and how the local players there, Syria's allies and its opponents, how they're trying to manage the situation, how they're reacting to it, and so on. So maybe I would like to just begin with your thoughts, Michael, about the situation, about the U.S.'s, about the latest developments, really, with the United Nations and what's happening in Syria. What's your take?
Well, I think that we shouldn't forget that the UN Security Council issued what's known as a presidential statement. It wasn't able really to come together to put out a full-fledged Security Council resolution. The reason for this is that the Russians and the Chinese remain reluctant to get involved on Syrian matters. So I think that in a way should put it into a little bit of perspective. It was certainly progress with respect to what we've seen in the last 4 months, when the United Nations, in fact, hasn't taken any decision on Syria, which became increasingly embarrassing. That the Hama, the assault on Hama last Sunday should have led to a presidential statement, to me is, maybe I expect too much, but somehow I feel it's much less than we're entitled to expect at this stage.
Why do you think, the Chinese and the Russians have been making a lot of noise lately about the situation in Syria? I think there was a very stern statement just a couple of days ago about something along the lines of Bashar al-Assad's future and so on. Why do you think they couldn't be budged on this?
I think there are many reasons. I think the Russians, first of all, feel that they were hoodwinked on the Libyan issue when they sort of didn't oppose a Security Council resolution, and Libya did have some costs for Russia, if I'm correct, in terms of oil. But at the same time, by and large, the Russians felt that they had signed off on an operation that they initially weren't very comfortable with. And that operation, indeed, today is completely bogged down. But I think we should look beyond that. The fact is that the Russians have had traditionally good ties with Syria, and I think they don't really feel comfortable at this point, once again, allowing the international community into this issue. But having said that, this position became untenable because the death toll kept rising. Now, there is, of course, the theoretical explanation that both China and Russia are uncomfortable with, with intervention in sovereign countries. That was sort of officially the line. But the fact is that, as I said, it became untenable after Hama. But still, this isn't going far enough.
Yeah. I recently had an exchange with a friend of mine on Facebook, and she made the point that the United States withdrew its ambassador from Syria the day after the Lebanese Prime Minister, or ex-Prime Minister, Rafiq al-Hariri, was assassinated on February 14th, 2005. The next day, they withdrew the U.S. ambassador. Whereas she noted the irony that Robert Ford was confirmed basically the day after the Hama massacre, or some, there was some very ironic coincidence. And so the Obama administration sent their ambassador to Damascus after a massacre, but withdrew their ambassador after the killing of this one individual. What do you, just to kind of shade into to focus in now on the American response, what is your take on Obama's approach? I don't know if we can call it a policy or a doctrine yet, at least on Syria.
Well, I mean, that's a good point your interlocutor raised. I think the thing is, though, this is a false debate. It's become a big debate in Washington. Should the U.S. leave the ambassador in Damascus or not? I honestly don't feel that this is the essence of the problem. The administration says, well, at this point, we need an ambassador in Damascus just to watch what's going on, to play a role. And to a certain extent, I actually agree with that. I don't think that the issue of withdrawing an ambassador at this point is really that relevant. The real issue is, what does the ambassador do? And the problem at this point is that Obama and the administration has had no policy on Syria. It hasn't had a doctrine. It hasn't had a policy. It's basically been a case of waiting and seeing and saying, leaking left and right, that the U.S. has relatively little leverage in Syria. Now, that may well be true, but, this is the United States. It's not Switzerland. It's not, Guam. Or it's not, it's a country that does, in a way, have to be able to create openings and diplomatic openings. The reason being, I've argued from the beginning, is that sooner or later this is going to become a major problem, a regional problem, if you don't deal with Syria. And I think, I'm not about to suggest that the U.S. should intervene militarily again. That's not going to happen. It's off the table. It's not going to work anyway. But certainly a diplomatic initiative that would have involved the Arab states and Russia and China. Only the U.S. has the wherewithal to initiate such a program, such a project.
Yeah. It occurred to me that this is a scenario that Bashar under fire, huge protests. This is a scenario that the Bush team would have died for, at least in the early years of the Syrian isolation. Later on, it became unclear what the Bush approach to Syria really was, and there was a kind of lessening of tension. But at least, in the early sort of 2004, 2005, when the pressure was really on, that they would have really relished this opportunity to kind of put extra pressure on. But it doesn't. My question is, what would that package really have involved beyond what we saw? I mean, they did put tremendous pressure on. They had the Europeans, the U.S. and Europe were able to come together on Syria. They were able to put in this package, this pressure package, sanctions, international condemnation, especially after the Hariri assassination. And it still didn't really work. So what do you see, as a practical policy for the Obama administration to take? What would that look like?
Well, in this particular case, not to go back to the Bush years, you're right, the policy worked and didn't work. It worked in some cases. In Lebanon, it worked in getting the Syrians out, but subsequently, obviously, it was much more problematic. But in this particular case, well, look, I think that you have enough on the table to make something interesting, to say, at least if you're the American president, to say, look, well, if this regime goes, you will have, in a way, weakened substantially a major Iranian ally in the Levant. Thinking as an American president, you would have essentially, removed from the game, or at least severely weakened, Hezbollah's strategic depth, Hezbollah in Lebanon. At the same time, you can go to different actors in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, who are very frightened of Iran, and who are very fearful to a certain extent of Hezbollah, and say, well, look, you guys, we can put together some kind of a diplomatic initiative to isolate Assad, to indicate to him that he has to leave. And I think the core of such a plan would have been to tell Assad and the regime, which is a fairly tight-knit team at the top of the Syrian leadership, to say, okay, it's finished, you've got to go. I think the U.S. could have brought in the Chinese and the Russians, as they did on an equally controversial issue, which was Iran, brought them in on this, and it would have taken work, it would have taken time and patience. But I think the U.S. could have played the role of reinvigorating this Arab corps, this diplomatic corps. You could have brought in, I think, the Saudis with a bit of convincing, as well as the Egyptians even. And the Qataris are already on board. I mean, there is, even the Iraqis, to a certain extent, who are very reluctant to see Syria the Syrian regime go, because they fear maybe a Sunni-dominated Syria. But I think only the U.S. could have brought these different actors together into a project to essentially lead to a peaceful transition in Damascus. And the thing is, yes, and you know this, I think, as well as anyone, it's that the Syrian regime has always been sensitive to power relationships. In other words, it's always been careful to ensure that it enjoys a certain measure of international support, and when it didn't have international support, it would create crisis to try to generate international support, to say, well, look, only Syria can solve this problem. And I think an isolated Assad family, and I'll stop here, but I mean, an isolated Assad family or Assad regime would have reacted differently than one that has basically looked around for the last 4 months and seen no one even bother to ask them to leave power.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we can get to the question of motive. In other words, convincing the U.S. administration, but also their allies in the region and then their international partners of the benefits of pursuing a policy like this. But let's just stick at first with the means. There are those who would argue that a diplomatic package or a diplomatic consensus on the need for Assad to leave would do really nothing in the end of the day to actually get to make a difference on the ground in Syria, and that actually it might be counterproductive, because this regime has seemed to kind of thrive on being put into a corner. That's precisely when they are able to batten down the hatches, and at the end of the day, it's a matter of life or death for this regime. And to some extent, some people would argue that also for the Alawite sect, or for many people at least in the Alawite sect. We did a blogging heads with a friend of mine, Camilo Trakji, a few months ago, and he made the point that for many people in Syria, minorities, but especially the Alawites, that they don't, this isn't a question of democracy versus dictatorship. This is really about survival. And so, no matter what the U.S. can do, bringing in Saudi Arabia or whoever, the Chinese and Russians, that even if Bashar was willing to step down, that the architecture around him wouldn't permit him to do that.
Yeah, that's possible. I mean, I'm not suggesting I have the silver bullet to this problem, but I think that today, if I were an Alawite in Syria, from the president's minority, I'd be quite worried, because, ultimately I look forward and I see, well, where is this going? Obviously, the Alawites cannot keep ruling Syria using the army to crush the vast majority of the population. I mean, at some point, as a minority, I'd be very scared of the situation today, because in a way, this regime is taking the minorities, and the Alawites in particular, towards essentially communal suicide. And I think that any component of a diplomatic initiative would obviously have to appeal to the minorities to suggest to them that their future is really not to be on the side of this murderous regime. It's true, minorities are scared in Syria. I can even see here in Lebanon that some of the Christians are worried. But by and large, yes, again, I think both of us, in one way or another, being from a minority, a Lebanese minority, we know that the situation, it's really short term when we say, well, look, if this regime stays, well, that's good for minorities. Look what happened in Iraq. The Christians of Iraq were also allied with Saddam's regime. What happened to the Christians of Iraq today? They've essentially, many of them have left the country. Some will say it's the end of the Christians of Iraq. It's not in the interest of any minority in the Middle East, I feel, to side with essentially gangsters, with autocrats. The only salvation for a minority in the Middle East is to be on good terms with their environment. And as it so happens, whether we like it or not, the majority of the environment happens to be Sunni. But minorities should not play communal politics. I think play this game of minorities versus majorities. And in Syria, I think it's very important at this stage that even the Alawites look around them and see, well, where is this leading? I mean, do they really believe that Syria will be stabilized because because those units of the Syrian army loyal to the regime have crushed the resistance in Hama and hope to crush the resistance in Homs and in Deir ez-Zor and in Daraa? This is not going to solve the problem of Syria or of the minorities. And I think you agree with this.
Yeah. No, I do. I mean, in a way, this whole discussion or this particular point, is a little bit academic because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what the vast majority of Alawites, ordinary Alawites, really think in Syria when it comes down to what the regime's calculations are about where its interests lie. And so, but your point is a good point.
I mean, you're right. I think you're right to say that there will be resistance from the regime, but in a way, the regime is only as strong or as weak as its immediate or its most ardent supporters. We know very well that the Syrian security units, military and security units leading the repression, are in some way or another dominated by the Alawites. If you can play on the Alawite loyalties, I think that's something that obviously that's one way to go into essentially to weaken the regime.
Yeah. I just want to go back to the issue of U.S., why the U.S. hasn't really been more bold, why the Obama administration hasn't taken stronger steps here. Not that they have a track record, at least in the context of the so-called Arab Spring. They haven't really been bold in any of the theaters. They've always kind of taken a passive approach. In Tunisia, they were not ahead of the game. In Egypt, they were a few steps behind where the action was. This is not a president, who likes to be out ahead in the issue, at least when it comes to his foreign policy. And so the question is, to what extent is his Syria policy just sort of a continuation of what, are they taking a wait and see approach because it worked to some extent in Egypt and Tunisia? They were at least able not to, foil themselves or shoot themselves in the foot, or so there's a question there of whether they're just kind of trying to improvise here, or whether, as some people suggest, this administration is, for a variety of reasons, actually very uncomfortable, as previous administrations have been, with the idea of a post-Assad Syria or a significant change at the highest levels of government in that country, in the same way that many of the Arab regimes are, including Saudi Arabia, which has been locked in a conflict with Syria for the past several years. At one point, it was very severe over Lebanon, over the situation in Lebanon. It was people called it a Cold War, but we don't see the Saudis right now joining the call for Assad to step down. In that same vein, many people have said, well, the U.S., for all its talk about democracy and for all the talk about the Iranian axis in the Middle East and versus the axis of moderation, the axis of evil versus the axis of moderation and so on, at the end of the day, they are actually very happy with the status quo in Syria. The Israelis are happy. Yes, Syria facilitates arms transfers to Hezbollah. Yes, Syria supports Hamas and so on. But at the end of the day, they've had decades of calm on that border between Syria and Israel. And so I'm curious as to what you think about, what the sort of the more strategic reasons might be, maybe or may not, for the U.S. inactivity on this front.
Well, I think there are many reasons. Let's start with the last point. Status quo, you're right. I think for a while there was a certain sense of, that the status quo may be better than anything we do. The status quo is broken at this point. Let's just face it. I think we can get rid of that at this point. I mean, even if this regime survives, it's going to survive how. I mean, it may take a long time in dying, but effectively it's dead. A regime that has to kill 2,000 to 3,000 people and can offer not an iota of sincere reform or serious reform is not a regime, I think, that would be able to regain its legitimacy. But I mean, your question is.
Well, I mean, that happened in the 80s, so go ahead.
Well, no, it was a bit different in the 80s. In the 80s, there was really an armed revolt by the Muslim Brotherhood. And the regime, in a way, today it's trying to play that by the playbook of the 80s. It's trying to provoke some kind of a violent revolt to be able to crush it and justify that, as it did in 1980. But it hasn't worked. Today, first of all, the revolt is nationwide. It's from the south of Syria, which used to be a backbone of the Ba'ath Party, to the the northwest, to the east, Deir ez-Zor, Kamishli, the Kurdish areas, to Damascus. I mean, we're really talking about something nationwide. We're not talking about a group that revolted. And of course, all this is happening, on internet, on television, on YouTube. It's not the same thing that we saw in the 1980s. But the United States, I mean, why, I'm guessing, but I think there are many things. I think, first of all, Obama is a president. Philosophically, this is a man who came into office wanting to focus on the United States. I mean, let's just face it. This is almost ironically, he came in with the same mindset that Bush did when he came into power in his first term, George W. Bush, who wanted to be, again, focused on the U.S. And Bush ended up going off on a long tangent in the Middle East. I think Obama is a man who really wants to focus on domestic American issues. The economy, these are the things that he considers important, healthcare, these were always his prize projects. And perhaps legitimately, I'm not blaming him. But the point of the matter is that when it comes to the Middle East, this is a president who was engaged, as I said, philosophically almost, in the Middle East. I'm not speaking immediately now about Afghanistan. In the Middle East, a drawdown. This is not someone who really wanted to increase his problems by focusing too much on Iraq, on the Gulf, on Syria, on Lebanon. So philosophically, I think we begin. This is not, as I said, an administration that didn't really have much of a Syria policy to begin with. I also think that Obama felt burned by Libya. I mean, this is, again, someone who's very methodical. His focus is on Afghanistan. He's put a lot of political credibility in Afghanistan. Libya is proving to be a disaster because it was very poorly planned. He doesn't really want to pick up a third crisis. Now, again, this is all understandable. The problem, I think, is that in the end, crises come, whether you like it or not. They're there. They show up and they suddenly threaten you, and you often do need to manage them. Of course, I didn't mention Egypt and Tunisia, Egypt being really the major issue today, the major concern for the U.S., given the possibility of the Muslim Brotherhood doing well in the elections. So Syria is really not on the American priority list. But Syria, nonetheless, is very important because Syria is about sectarian conflict. This regime has provoked sectarian tensions and sectarian conflict. And if today you have sectarian conflict spreading across Syria's borders, it can spread to places like Lebanon and Iraq. And suddenly you have a major headache. And frankly, the United States, this will affect, in one way or another, American interests in the region. Yeah. So, I mean, I think there are many reasons. There is a philosophical reason. There is the fact that Obama is not, feels that he has enough problems on his plate not to get involved in Syria. And there is this sense, as I said, this sort of sense, this rather dreary sense in this administration that we don't have leverage. It's an administration that always tends to look at its difficulties rather than to look at its advantages. And this was, by the way, noticeable in Obama's speech, if I recall, in Cairo, where he complained about the fact that the U.S. doesn't have a lot of money. So, that's the problem. I mean, to engage in policy, you need to a certain extent, have a good amount of self-confidence.
Yeah. The question, there's also another element, which is even if they were self-confident and even if they had a lot of energy and felt that this was a major priority for them, there is the local internal issue of who will come to power after Assad. It's not so much an issue of the wrong people will come to power. I mean, that's certainly one of the alternatives in the.
But
calculus
yes, can I
there,
cut you off? Doesn't this? Sorry to
Yes.
cut you off, and let me ask you a question. But before I cut you off, shouldn't this, in fact, push you to be more hands-on? In other words, if you're afraid of the aftermath, then isn't a sort of laissez-faire policy effectively a way of saying, I'm not going to play a role in the possible aftermath of an Assad fall?
Well, sure. I mean, neither you nor I are privy to what they know, what they don't know, and actually how engaged they are, behind the scenes. I mean, certainly the public front is not that doesn't look particularly engaged. But I wonder, what they imagine. I mean, in Egypt, the alternatives are at least fairly clear because Mubarak, for all of his flaws, did not. I mean, he tried to suppress the Muslim Brotherhood and some of the other opposition parties, but it was nowhere near the kind of ruthless campaign that the Assads were very successfully able to wage on Syria's opposition parties. I mean, there was no real organized Syrian opposition in the country for decades, basically. So you don't have that kind of infrastructure that exists in Egypt, where people can mobilize constituents, where parties can click their fingers and have 2 million people demonstrating downtown Cairo. So in Syria, the opposition abroad and in the country itself is not that well known, and maybe not that well organized, and so it's not like you have somebody that the Arabs can kind of get behind, or the Turks, or somebody with some kind of stature, even like Baradei, in Egypt, somebody who doesn't have a chance in hell really becoming president, but at least people know him, people are excited by him, or some of the various other candidates. Whereas in Syria, it's kind of a black box to some extent.
I agree with you. It is a black box, and that's precisely why I think any government should have, enough means to forecast crises. Now, I know that's easy to say. The fact of the matter is the U.S. wasn't even able to forecast what happened in Egypt. So I don't think, maybe it would be too much to expect for them to forecast what happened in Syria. But, they were putting a lot of money into Egypt. They should have had a better sense of what went on there. But, if we're going to stop at this American or that American shortcoming when it comes to knowing what's going on in the region, I think we can spend the rest of our talk talking about that. But let me ask you this one question, and to be fair to the administration, so I don't sound unfair. Even within the United States, I think, and perhaps you can answer my question, do you feel that there is latitude, or there was latitude, for Obama to engage in some kind of diplomatic initiative? Now, we've seen now Congress turning around on that, but do you think 2 or 3 months ago or 1 month ago this was as easy? I don't know.
Well, 2 or 3 months ago would have put us at the beginning of the summer. Well, if he had done it in May, right after they captured bin Laden, I think he was walking on water at that point. He could have done anything overseas, or at least begin a campaign, and people would have been behind him. But now his poll numbers were so low; they're approaching Bush era low. He has been, the debt ceiling crisis really made his administration look weak. You don't get points for being a great compromiser until after your tenure is done, I think. And that's essentially what Obama is. I mean, he's a great compromiser, a great communicator, whose enormous supply of political capital has sort of slowly been sapped over the past 3 years, because he's tried to compromise his way through several very ambitious initiatives, which is actually a good thing, which is something you have to do when you have an opposition that is so intransigent and intent on stifling your agenda. But it hasn't, he's not the kind of Jesus figure that he was when he came in. And the polls have shown this, not only in the United States, but also in the region. People are generally disenchanted with Obama. They feel that he's done nothing on the Israel-Palestine front, which he hasn't really. And that they haven't taken a bold enough, they haven't been participatory enough in, in the kind of mind-altering events that we've witnessed in the region. So, but again, I think that it has as much to do with their own, the lack of a coherent policy, as it does with
exactly.
These larger,
this is an administration that hasn't had. I'm sorry to cut you off. Go ahead if you want to finish that sentence.
No, I was gonna say that something that came out of WikiLeaks recently reminded me of just how entrenched these kinds of calculations can be. There was a cable that was released that came out of the U.S. Embassy in Paris just about a week ago, and it was a cable about the situation in Lebanon. So it was from 2005, and the Lebanese ex-prime minister Rafiq Hariri had been assassinated several months before, and there was a big UN investigation that everybody thought was going to target Syria. And the first prosecutor, the investigator, Detlef Meles, a German prosecutor, was in Beirut, and he was compiling this report that everybody was sort of waiting, on the edge of their seats to basically to see what he was going to say. And there was this huge effort, and all eyes were trained on Lebanon. And U.S. embassy officials were meeting with French intelligence officials. I think it was in September or October or something. It was before Meles' report came out. And even at that early stage, the French were expressing their concerns about where this all would lead. Now, the French were they and the Americans, the Chirac administration and the Bush administration, were the two major driving forces in the international community's effort to get this UN investigation in place. And yet, behind the scenes, very quietly, the French were expressing their reservations about how high up the chain of command this thing could go if the Syrians were implicated, whether it would be optimal for Bashar al-Assad to kind of cut a couple of his generals, his intelligence people loose, without it leading to a kind of palace coup scenario. And they were, very concerned about what kind of instability that would wreak. So, from my perspective now, looking back on that, if the French, let's let them sort of stand in for the Europeans. If they were that concerned about the results of a tribunal report or a UN investigation report about what that could do to Syria, I mean, imagine what their calculations are today. I don't think that, you could make the same case about the Israelis that if Assad goes, given that there is no kind of Baradei figure to step in, and there's no fresh face of some exciting kind of democracy, March 14th type party in Syria that is going to kind of step in and just maintain the status quo, but under a kind of pro-Saudi, pro-American line. I think the status quo presents a compelling argument to kind of just manage and contain the situation.
If I can disagree.
I mean, from their perspective, not from my perspective.
Yeah, well, I think the French have actually been far ahead of the Americans on Assad. First of all, in their doubts about Assad, in their doubts about Assad's survivability. Ironically, the French, who before the United States opened a dialogue with Assad after Hariri's assassination, today, before the United States, they essentially broke with Assad. And I don't think it was a coincidence, for example, that French soldiers in the United Nations force in southern Lebanon were targeted a few weeks ago. But I don't think today that the French are that wedded to the status quo. Let me go beyond that. If I could just say, I'm a bit of an optimist, and maybe I'm wrong, but I was having dinner with a Lebanese politician not long ago, and I mean, he's someone who's dealt with the Syrians for years and decades. He knows them well. He's been on and off allied with them, and I think you know who I'm talking about. But anyway,
I know exactly who you're talking about.
and the question came up: well, what happens after the Assads? And the answer was something to the effect: well, no, I mean, Syrian society can find a replacement, or not a replacement to Assad, but can find a solution to this problem. And I think, to a certain extent, I think this notion is the correct one. We're dealing today with the difference, I think, that we have with Egypt, for example, that we had in Tunisia, but I don't want to compare too much. What we have in Syria is a complex uprising. It's not just rural elements, or it's not just urban elements. It's not just people living in Cairo and Alexandria. What we're seeing is something much broader. It's broad in sectarian terms. It's broad in ethnic terms. This has reached the Kurdish areas of Syria. Obviously, the majority are Sunnis, but that doesn't mean it's only a Sunni uprising or a sectarian uprising. It's not. This is something that has gone from the rural area of Daraa to the urban areas of Hama and Homs, around Damascus, Deir ez-Zor. It's been really nationwide. We're talking about a revolt of an entire society. Now, of course, we can disagree on numbers, and some will say Bashar still has popularity. Fine. I think that what we've seen since this began is, in fact, an expansion of the rebellion, of the revolt, of the intifada. Why don't we use that noble word, the intifada, against this regime, in the face of the most brutal, savage tactics, the arrest of tens of thousands of people, firing live ammunition at people. And this has remained peaceful. By and large, this has remained peaceful. Let's forget the nonsense that this is an armed rebellion. That's nonsense. Even if there were one or incidents where people used weapons, by and large, this has been peaceful, and there's plenty of evidence for that. Now, any kind of movement that can engage in a rebellion or an intifada with such discipline is one, I feel, and maybe I'm too optimistic, but I feel is one that can also replace the sordid regime that they will, I hope, get rid of sooner rather than later. In that sense, they have shown their maturity. This, up to now, for me, is the most impressive of all the Arab revolts we've seen in recent months, simply because they've managed to continue to pursue a peaceful or a relatively peaceful path towards change, and they've tried to avoid as much as possible the sectarian traps that the regime has set for them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just let me play devil's advocate and take the position of somebody who is pro-regime, not for the sake of being pro-regime, but who might be a member of a minority, or who calls himself risk-averse, like my friend who I interviewed, or who I had a conversation with a couple months ago on Blogging Heads, who says, that Syria is not like Egypt. It's not like Tunisia. There are sectarian issues. There are ethnic issues. Syria, you have Arabs, you have Kurds, you have all kinds of different groups. You have, of course, the different religious groups. You have the situation where they're part of this struggle, this resistance issue. There are all kinds of potentially divisive factors that are sort of latent in the society there that are inevitably going to bubble up to the surface, and there's no real way for this situation to be resolved amicably without heading towards civil war. It's not like if Assad, Assad can't just step down, the system won't let him. And so if the Intifada is not going to result in a kind of Tahrir Square moment where everybody is unified behind getting rid of Mubarak, and then there's a peaceful transition. That's just not in the cards in Syria. There cannot be a peaceful transition. There are just too many. It's more like Lebanon or Iraq, because this is the argument you hear over and over again by people who aren't necessarily Bashar lovers, but who are just terrified about where the situation will go. That a civil war or some kind of bloody civil conflict is an inevitability if Bashar's regime falls. What do you say to somebody like that?
Well, yeah, look, I mean, certainly there is, I think, to a certain extent, an understandable fear of people that this will dissolve into civil conflict. At the same time, those who use this line of argument, intentionally or unintentionally, are making a case for the status quo, for stalemate, for leaving things as they are. Because let's face it, there is no reformist option in Syria under Bashar's regime. There is none. It's zero. Had there been one, the regime, I think, would have, oddly enough, taken it. But as you say quite correctly, the regime cannot take it. Bashar cannot take it. By the way, I think Bashar is the regime and the regime is Bashar. The notion that Bashar wants to reform but that Maher, his brother, doesn't, or that the cousins don't, I mean, this is nonsense. They're all part of the same structure of power. So my answer to these people is, well, essentially you want the status quo, or even if you don't want the status quo, you are effectively defending the status quo. At this point, I think that argument becomes academic. Today, we are 4 months into a revolt, which has led to the death of between 2, 3, perhaps more, 1,000 people, the arrest of tens of thousands. I think, as we say in Lebanon, the jar is broken. I don't think that you can put the genie back into the bottle. So what is what do you do? If you're part of a minority, well, you begin to think seriously about whether you should continue to side with this murderous regime, this regime that ultimately is destined to fall. You have to make very tough decisions. And the moral decision is to side with a democratic Syria, or to hope that there is a democratic Syria. But I think also the self-interested decision is to say these people are not going to last. You cannot last after all this. And even if you do last after all this, all it will mean is that within another few years you will have another revolt that will be even worse, that will probably then be an armed revolt. You're trapped at this point. You're trapped, and the only way out of this trap is to keep putting pressure on the Assad regime peacefully to avoid the sectarian trap. And that's why I would hope that the minorities will side with those who are calling peacefully for a removal of the regime. But this also has to be complemented, I feel, by outside efforts to put together a transitional plan to get rid of the Assads, to avoid more violence. Because look, bottom line, yes, as you know, again, you know this well from your knowledge of Lebanese politics, the Syrians have often been accused of being fire starters and firemen. In other words, they start fires and then come and say, well, we're the only ones who can, extinguish it. Well, this is what they're trying to do in Syria today. They're effectively trying to heighten sectarian tension, to say, look, if we go, there will be a slaughter afterwards. There will be a terrible sectarian civil war if we fall. Therefore, you have every interest in defending our continuation in power, in not pushing us out of power. I think it's important that the international community and the Arab world even, because this will affect the Arabs above all, is say, no, we're not going to play this game. You people are finished. Yeah. The best we're willing to do is to offer you a way out of Syria. And even then, I don't think any guarantees should be made in terms of what, potential issues before the International Criminal Court. I mean, that's my view.
Yeah. Let's just, in the time we have left, I wanted to kind of get your take on how this is all playing out in Lebanon, since you're in Beirut at the moment, and you have your finger on the pulse of what's happening there. One thing that people have remarked upon is just how muted and how tentative the conversation is in Lebanon about what's happening across the border. You have people who are saying, making a brave attempt at condemnation, but they're saying things like, "We shall not be silent." I'm thinking of the leader of the March 14th, the sort of U.S. European supported coalition of parties, Saad Hariri, who was the son of the assassinated ex-prime minister, declaring, of course, from abroad that the Lebanese should not be silent, decrying the Lebanese response to the United Nations condemnation of Syria. Meanwhile, other parties in Lebanon, of course, Syria's allies have abstained, obviously, from criticizing. But even those who are critical of Syria, some of the other Christian groups, have not really. There is a kind of tentative air about the whole situation, mainly because people seem to be just very unsure of how it'll play out in Lebanon. How do you think it would? How will this impact Lebanon?
Well, obviously you're right. I mean, many people are unsure, and so they don't want to take a stance. Now, in terms of the politics, you're quite right. Hariri did issue a statement after the assault on Hama. But let's face it, it's the first statement he's issued on the Syrian on the Syrian crisis in 4 months. And one of the reasons I suspect he didn't do it before is because he felt that the Saudis would not have been happy with the statement. But I think also it had reached such a stage of of embarrassment that no one in Lebanon had said anything about the Syrian crisis. As you said, particularly those who had traditionally opposed the Syrian regime, those in the so-called March 14 coalition. I think also we have to understand that Saad Hariri is a Sunni leader in Lebanon, and I think to a certain extent it was important for him for reasons we don't need to go into, but he needed to send a message to his co-religionists in Syria that somehow he was in solidarity with them. And of course, when he made his statement, suddenly all his political allies who had remained silent for the last 3 or 4 months, suddenly they began issuing statements too. And they did this, I think, for a variety of reasons. First, the green light had been given and they wanted to say something. Also, it was used in terms of domestic Lebanese politics to put pressure on the government of Najib Mikati, in which, of course, Hezbollah is playing a major role. And Hezbollah, which is, of course, the great defender of the deprived, unfortunately has taken a position openly siding with the Syrian regime against the deprived in Syria, which of course has led to, naturally, more division in Lebanon. One side siding with the regime, one side against the regime, siding with the if you will, with the intifada against the regime. And of course, the result of this, as you said earlier, there was when the UN took the decision this week to issue a presidential statement, Lebanon abstained. It didn't support the condemnation of Syria, and this led to a big furore domestically. But to be fair, I mean, I'm no big fan of this government. I think you know where I stand on this government. But to be fair, I think Lebanon was always going to abstain. Had Saad al-Hariri been prime minister, I think he would have been forced to abstain. Lebanon cannot afford I think it would have been very difficult for Lebanon not to abstain on something like this. As much as I, in fact, condemn this decision, I think it was very cowardly. Morally, it was completely indefensible. But politically, in terms of just political interest, unfortunately, Lebanon was always going to abstain.
Yeah, let's let's not hold the Mikati government up to standards that Hariri himself would not have been able to meet, which is Nasrallah's argument in his one of his more recent speeches. But just to stick with the whole Hezbollah angle, this is a very interesting dynamic now. I had a feature on my blog a few months ago where I collated all of Hezbollah's statements about the various revolutions or the various uprisings, Tunisia, Bahrain, Yemen, Egypt, all around the region, which were all very strongly in favor of the people and supporting the people and ending autocracy. And then, of course, we have the statement about what's happening in Syria that is a complete 180-degree approach. And I think that this is, in a way, there's the core constituency, Hezbollah's core constituency in Lebanon is not going to be swayed by what's happening in Syria. They're not going to, Hezbollah is not going to lose support from the people who really depend on the party, who have fit into their patronage networks, who also admire the party for all for its platform. But I'm thinking now about, there's also a group in Lebanon, there's sort of the middle. I don't know if it's sort of the vast middle that you have in other countries or if it's a very small middle, but there is definitely a group of a certain segment of the Lebanese population that is frustrated with the dynamic, the polarization in Lebanese politics, where you have March 14th, this pro-Western coalition that has seen its fortunes fade in certain ways, and then you have the so-called March 8th coalition composed of the traditional kind of pro-resistance parties, plus the Michel Aoun's party, the Free Patriotic Movement. And so there's a segment of the population that is tired of this division, but has in certain ways kind of been willing to give the March 8th coalition, the Hezbollah coalition, the benefit of the doubt. They're kind of sick and tired of March 14th, of those same faces. They want a fresh start. Many of them are very sympathetic to the resistance agenda. They feel that they're very much in solidarity with the Palestinian people. And then you have people who like the idea, the image of a kind of technocratic party that we see in that the FPM, the Free Patriotic Movement, tries to project. To what extent do you think that these two parties, Hezbollah and their Christian allies, the Free Patriotic Movement, are going to be hurt by their stands today on the Syrian crisis? The leader of the FPM, Michel Aoun, gave a really shameful, speech a couple of days ago, where he basically, after the Hama massacre, where he came out supporting the Assad regime, and this was a man who fought Syria, who was exiled from Lebanon for 15 years because of his opposition to Syria, and is now really kind of holding the flag for this regime. What is your sense of how the crisis in Syria is going to impact the political fortunes of Syria's allies in Lebanon?
Look, Lebanon is a country where shamelessness is not a vice. I think very little, and the reason being, look, whatever happens outside of Lebanon is not ultimately going to have a very severe impact on sectarian solidarities. In other words, Hezbollah today, you're quite right to say that Hezbollah will not lose its communal support because of its position on Syria. It will not. The reason being that a vast majority of the Shia community, not all, but the majority, today are with Hezbollah. Whatever Hezbollah says, they're with Hezbollah, because if Hezbollah, they feel, loses ground, the community will lose ground. This is a purely sectarian calculation. We're in a period of sectarian polarization in Lebanon, and Nasrallah can say whatever he wants, the community will follow him. And whether it listens or not, it's irrelevant. It's going to be with Hezbollah. Aoun supporters are much the same way. They're with Aoun, whatever he says. He's shameless. The man has been a disaster for the last 20 years politically. I don't think he's succeeded in any one of his major projects, except one, perhaps. Now he is probably he's the most powerful Christian in Parliament, but he wanted to be more than that. But the fact of the matter is that won't affect in any way the support for Aoun. People will follow Aoun because they feel that he's their communal champion. The same goes for those on the other side. Saad al-Hariri can say a lot of things. He will be followed by the Sunnis. Samir Jaja, another Maronite leader, the head of the Lebanese forces, will say a lot of things. He will be followed. Lebanon is really today very much caught up in sectarian calculations. There is polarization. The sense of a unified state has never been as weak in my living experience, and I lived throughout much of the war, and during the war years, there was the perception that Lebanon was a country was stronger probably than it is today. I would take issue with one thing you said. The vast middle of Lebanese, wherever their political solidarities lie, are by and large concerned with basic things, like the vast middle in many countries. They're, namely economics, their future, their children's future, their well-being. They may be with Aoun, they may be with Jaja, they may be with Hariri, they may be with Nasrallah, but by and large, the vast middle is cross-sectarian. What they really want is they want to live in a country where they have a certain amount of security. security in terms of their livelihood. This is a country going through a serious economic crisis. As you know very well, Lebanese youths the first thing they think of when they end up school, when they finish school, is to leave the country. When they finish college, is to leave the country. So by and large, the middle, I don't think we would be doing ourselves a service by defining it in political terms or resistance or all that. I don't believe that those are the main issues.
Yeah.
The vast middle just wants, like most people in the world, they want security and stability in their lives and in their finances, in their livelihoods.
But I agree with you, and what is always surprising to me is the fact that you don't find anybody, you don't really find a kind of credible movement, political movement that is based on, that stakes its future on trying to appeal to that vast middle. I mean, if those are really the major concerns, and if sectarianism is, while a potent force, not the overwhelming determinant of how people vote or who they choose to support, and if other issues play a role but aren't as important as economic issues, then why don't we see more people, more parties kind of pandering to, or at least catering to that kind of
Well, yes, you know the reason. Unfortunately, you know the reason, and I mean this is an argument a discussion we've had when we discussed my book. Unfortunately, one of the disadvantages of sectarianism, I defended certain advantages, but there are very real disadvantages, is that in a way you have a weak state. So people, whenever they look towards some element of salvation, they're looking for a life raft, they tend to fall back on community. They tend to fall back on their communal representatives because the state has lost credit or is discredited or has not gained credit or earned credit. I mean, this is unfortunately one of the things that we have to face. So that if you have a social contract that is broken down, I mean, even let's assume Lebanon is a sort of, a social contract built on an alliance of different communities. But these communities at least have to give to the state a certain amount of credibility so the state can take decisions. Today, we're very far from that. So unfortunately, cross-sectarian parties aren't really being formed because most people tend to look towards their sectarian leaderships. It's very unfortunate. I mean, you're right to say that, but we tend to think maybe because we're a bit more, maybe more westernized, because we tend to, and that really sounds very condescending. I don't mean that, but we tend to take an approach that maybe someone in the West would take. But in this society, unfortunately, the sectarian representatives tend to be much stronger, and and that's the reality. It's an unfortunate reality.
Yeah. Well, before this turns into a discussion of Lebanese inside baseball, and we'll have to have a conversation about the Lebanese situation very soon. But I think that we've covered everything we wanted to talk about. Was there anything else that you wanted to bring up before we sign off?
No, I think we've pretty much covered everything. I think we've covered. Okay. You'll see. I think you'll soon be landing in this happy place. So you'll see for yourself.
Yeah. Okay. Well, with that, then we'll pick this up again. Hopefully, things will not continue to escalate. In at least in a violent way in Syria, and the United States will and the international community will find a more proactive way of dealing with it. So anyway, hope to see you soon, Michael.
Well, thanks, yes, and I share your hopes when it comes to Syria. I really do. And I hope to see you soon. Not far from where I am right now.
Okay.
Okay.
Exactly. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.